You little brat! Admiral Thomas Caldwell slammed his fist on the tactical table so hard the coffee cups jumped, and 5,000 soldiers heard the crack of his voice tear through the command center. He pointed one thick finger at the young woman who had dared interrupt his briefing. You walk into my operation, my house, and tell me my plan is broken. Get out before I have you removed. But Colonel Maya Anderson didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just looked at the map and said 6 quiet words that would haunt him before nightfall. Before we go on, if you love a story about the underestimated rising when it matters most, take a second right now to subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The 6 words Maya Anderson spoke were these: Northridge collapses in 20 minutes. She said them without heat, without a tremble, the way a doctor might read a diagnosis off a chart. And for one full breath, the largest command center at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, went so silent you could hear the hum of the servers cooling behind the wall. Admiral Thomas Caldwell was a legend, and legends do not enjoy silence in their own rooms. He was 61 years old, 40 of those years in uniform, and in all that time, nobody had ever stood in front of his tactical map and told him his defense would break. Generals had disagreed with him. Politicians had questioned him. Once a foreign commander had called his strategy reckless, and Caldwell had proven him wrong on the field within a week. His record was not just good, it was untouched, undefeated. And a man who has never lost learns to believe he cannot lose. So he laughed. It started low in his chest, and then it grew, and then it filled the entire room, that loud, deliberate laugh that was not really about anything funny at all. It was a laugh meant to remind every soldier watching exactly who owned this floor. You hear this? He said, turning to the 2 colonels beside him. She's been in my command center for 4 minutes. 4 minutes, and she's already rewriting the battle. One of the colonels chuckled because it was safe to chuckle. A major near the back smiled at the floor. A captain looked away because looking away was easier than choosing a side. But nobody in that room said a single word in Maya's defense. She stood there in her clean uniform with no combat medals pinned across her chest, no famous name trailing behind her, no reputation walking into the room ahead of her. She was 34 years old, and she looked younger, and to a man like Caldwell, that was the whole problem. Youth was something to be tolerated, not trusted. Sir, Maya said, and her voice was steady, I'm not here to challenge your authority. No, Caldwell folded his arms. Then why exactly did you interrupt a briefing that 50 senior officers came here to receive? Because I read your northern supply route this morning, as she said, and it depends on a single communications relay running through Sector 9. If that relay fails, you lose contact with 3 forward units at once. There is no backup path. There is no redundancy. You built a perfect plan on top of one single point that can break. The words landed cleaner than a slap. Caldwell's smile stayed on his face, but something behind his eyes shifted just slightly, the way a man's face changes when a stranger says something true that he was hoping nobody would notice. Sector 9 has been operational for 6 years, he said. 6 years without stress, Maya answered. You're about to put 5,000 soldiers in a full combat simulation through it in the same hour. That's not 6 years of proof. That's the first real test it's ever faced. A murmur ran through the officers, low and quick, the sound of 50 trained minds, all doing the same math at the same time and not liking the answer. Caldwell heard it, and that was what made him angry. Not that she was wrong, that the room wasn't sure she was wrong. What is your name, Colonel? He asked, and now the warmth was gone from his voice. Anderson, Maya Anderson. Anderson. He said it slowly, tasting it, deciding what to do with it. And where did you serve, Colonel Anderson, that gave you the expertise to walk into Fort Liberty and lecture me, because I've read a lot of files in my life and I don't remember reading yours? That's because you weren't supposed to, Maya said. The room shifted again. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Excuse me. I'm not here as a participant, sir. I'm here as an observer. An observer? He almost laughed again, but this one caught in his throat. Sent by who? Maya held his eyes. General Robert Hayes. If the name had been a gunshot, the room could not have gone quieter. General Robert Hayes was the highest regional commander over 3 installations, the man whose signature could end a career or launch one, the man Caldwell himself answered to. And nobody invoked that name lightly. You're lying, Caldwell said, but it came out too fast. You can check, Maya said, and she reached into the folder she was carrying, the small classified folder nobody had thought to ask about, and she set a single sheet of paper on the tactical table and slid it toward him. My orders, signed with 4 days ago. I'm here to conduct an independent leadership evaluation of this command during the readiness exercise. That's all. You were never supposed to know until I filed my report, but I read your northern route this morning, and I decided some things are more important than staying quiet. Caldwell picked up the paper. His eyes moved across it once, then again slower. And every officer in that room watched the color rise in the neck of a man who had not been embarrassed in front of his soldiers in 20 years. This is my operation, he said finally, and his voice was quieter now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. I've run this base for 4 years. I've won every exercise they've ever thrown at me. And you want me to believe that a woman I've never met, sent by a general who didn't have the courtesy to warn me, knows my northern route better than I do? No, sir, Maya said. I want you to check the relay before the exercise starts. That's all I'm asking. 10 minutes. Send someone to Sector 9 and confirm it can carry the load. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize in front of everyone here, and I'll write in my report that Admiral Caldwell runs a flawless command. If I'm right, you'll have saved yourself the worst hour of your career. It was a reasonable request. Everyone in the room knew it was reasonable. And that was exactly why Caldwell could not say yes. Because saying yes meant that a 34-year-old colonel he'd called a brat had told him what to do in front of 5,000 soldiers, and he had obeyed. And a man who has never lost does not know how to do that. He never learned. Nobody ever taught him because nobody ever thought he'd need it. The exercise begins on schedule, Caldwell said. As designed, as I built it. Maya didn't argue. She simply nodded once, folded her orders back into the folder, and stepped away from the table. Then I'll observe, she said. And she walked to the back wall to a spot where she could see every screen and every officer, and she stood there with her tablet, and she waited. Caldwell turned back to his briefing, as if nothing had happened. He raised his voice. He pointed at the map. He talked about coordination and initiative and the honor of Fort Liberty. But something in the room had changed, and everyone felt it, and no amount of confidence in his voice could put it back the way it was. Because now, at the edge of every officer's mind, sat a single quiet question. What if she's right? The exercise was scheduled to begin at 0800. At 7:40, a young communications specialist named Emily Parker stood at her station in a cramped corner of the operations floor, and her hands were shaking, and she could not make them stop. She was 26 years old. She had been at Fort Liberty for 5 years, which meant she had joined at 21, barely more than a kid. And in those 5 years, she had learned exactly one lesson better than any other. The lesson was this: when something is wrong, you can report it once. You do not report it twice. Because the second report makes you a problem, and problems do not get promoted, and problems do not last. And something was wrong. Emily had been watching the Sector 9 relay for 3 days, ever since the load projections came down for the exercise, and the numbers had been bothering her the whole time. The relay had a latency ceiling. Everyone who worked the comms floor knew it had a latency ceiling. Under normal traffic, it was invisible, a delay so small it didn't matter. But under the traffic, this exercise was about to push through it. That small delay would stack and stack and stack until the units on the far end of the northern route were receiving orders seconds late. And in a combat simulation, seconds late was the same as never. She had reported it once, 4 days ago. She had walked up to her section chief, a hard man named Master Sergeant Doyle, and she had shown him the numbers, and Doyle had looked at them for about 6 seconds. That relay's been fine for 6 years, Doyle had said. It's never carried a load like this, Emily had answered. You saying the Admiral built a bad plan? And that was the sentence that ended it, because she was not saying the Admiral built a bad plan. She was saying a relay had a limit. But at Fort Liberty, those two things had somehow become the same thing, and to point at any weakness in the operation was to point at the man who built it, and nobody pointed at the man who built it. No, Sergeant, Emily had said. I'm not saying that. Then log it and move on. So she had logged it, and she had moved on. And for 4 days, she had watched the clock crawl toward 0800 with a sick feeling in her stomach, knowing what was coming, knowing she was the only one who knew, and knowing that saying it out loud one more time would cost her more than staying silent ever could. At 0742, She looked up from her station and saw the woman. The colonel who had interrupted the admiral. The one everyone was whispering about. She was standing against the back wall with a tablet, and she was not looking at the big screens like everyone else. She was looking at the people. She was watching the room the way you watch a room when you're trying to find the one person who's afraid. And for 1 second, her eyes found Emily's. Emily looked away fast. She always looked away fast. That was another lesson you learned. But the colonel didn't. Maya Anderson had spent the last 40 minutes doing exactly what she was sent to do, which was to see. And she had seen a great deal. She had seen a lieutenant named Ross approach a senior officer with a tablet, start to speak, get waved off, and retreat with his shoulders low. She had seen a logistics sergeant quietly change a number on a status board from red to yellow, not because the situation improved, but because red drew attention and attention drew trouble. She had seen 40 officers laugh at their admiral's joke a half second after he made it every laugh time to a man who could end them. And now she had seen a young specialist in the corner whose hands were shaking 40 minutes before an exercise that was supposed to be routine. Maya had been doing this long enough to know that shaking hands don't lie. Faces lie, words lie, status boards lie. But a body that's been holding a secret too long always tells the truth eventually, and Emily Parker's body was screaming. Maya crossed the floor. She did it quietly without hurry, and she stopped a respectful distance from the specialist's station, and she spoke in a voice pitched low enough that only Emily could hear it. "You know something," Maya said. It wasn't a question. Emily's throat closed. "Ma'am, I've been watching you for 40 minutes, specialist. You've checked the same readout 11 times. Your hands are shaking, and every time someone senior walks near your station, you stop breathing." Maya's voice stayed gentle. "You know something about this operation, and you're afraid to say it. I want you to say it to me." Emily looked at the older woman, at the calm face and the steady eyes and the folder tucked under her arm, and she felt the words rise in her chest, and then she felt the 5 years of fear come down on top of them like a lid. "There's nothing, ma'am," she said. "Everything's nominal." "Specialist, everything's nominal, ma'am, I promise." Maya was quiet for a moment, and then she did something that Emily did not expect. She didn't push. She didn't order. She just leaned in slightly and said the thing that no one at Fort Liberty had said to Emily Parker in 5 years. "If you're right," Maya said, "and you stay silent and it breaks, then you will carry that. Not the admiral, not the sergeant. You. Because you knew. So I'm going to ask you one time, and then I'll walk away and never mention it again if you want me to. What do you know?" And something in Emily broke loose. "The relay," she whispered. "Sector 9. It has a latency ceiling, and the load projection for the exercise is above it. It'll be fine for the first 20 minutes because the traffic ramp's slow. But once all the units go active, the delay stacks in the northern route loses sync, and the forward teams stop getting orders in real time. I ran it 3 times. I reported it 4 days ago. They told me to log it and move on." Maya didn't change expression, but something in her eyes went very still. "You reported this 4 days ago," she said. "In writing." "Yes, ma'am, it's in the log." "To whom?" "Master Sergeant Doyle." "And he did what with it?" Emily hesitated. "He told me the relay had been fine for 6 years. Maya nodded slowly. She understood everything now. She understood the whole shape of it. This was not a story about a broken relay. A broken relay was a 2-hour fix. This was a story about a room where the truth arrived 4 days early and got told to sit down and be quiet. "Thank you, Specialist Parker," Maya said. "You just did the bravest thing anyone in this building has done all morning." Emily blinked. "I didn't do anything, ma'am." "You will," Maya said. And she walked back toward the tactical table, and the clock on the wall read 0751, and Admiral Thomas Caldwell was wrapping up his briefing with the confidence of a man who had no idea that the woman he'd called a brat now held in her tablet the exact reason his perfect operation was about to fail. She could have gone to him. That was the thing Maya turned over in her mind as she crossed the floor. She could have walked straight up to Caldwell, laid Emily's data in front of him, and forced the issue. She had the authority. Hayes had given her the authority. One phone call and the exercise stopped. But stopping the exercise would fix the relay and nothing else. And Maya had not been sent to Fort Liberty to fix a relay. She had been sent to find out why a command with the best record in the region felt wrong from the inside. Why the status boards were always green in a place where green things should sometimes be red. Why General Hayes, reading Caldwell's flawless reports month after month, had gotten a feeling in his gut that a record that clean was hiding something dirty. Now Maya knew. The command wasn't clean, it was silent. And silence and cleanliness look identical on a status board, right up until the moment they don't. So she made a decision, and it was a hard one, and it was the decision that would define everything that came after. She would let it break. Not far, not dangerously. It was a simulation, no real lives at stake. And the moment it crossed from instructive into hazardous, she would end it herself. But she would let Caldwell feel the weight of his own silence. She would let 5,000 soldiers watch what happens when the truth is standing in the room 40 minutes early and everyone decides they'd rather not hear it. Because a man like Caldwell would never learn from a warning. He would only learn from a wound. Maya took her place against the back wall. She opened her tablet, and she began very quietly to record. At 7:58, Caldwell caught her eye across the room. He didn't come to her. He wouldn't give her that. But he held her gaze for a long second, and there was a message in it, and the message was clear. I don't care what your orders say. I don't care whose name you carry. This is my floor, and in 2 minutes I'm going to prove you wrong in front of every soldier who watched you embarrass yourself, and you're going to write it in your report. Maya held his gaze right back, and she gave him nothing. At 800, Admiral Thomas Caldwell straightened, looked out over his command center, and gave the order in the deep voice that had commanded soldiers for 40 years. Begin the exercise. For the first 20 minutes, everything was beautiful. The screens lit up with movement. Units advanced across the simulated terrain in clean, coordinated waves. The northern force pushed toward the ridge exactly as designed. Supply markers flowed up the route in steady green streams. Officers called out status reports, and every report was good, and Caldwell stood at the center of it with his arms folded in a small, satisfied set to his mouth. And every few minutes he let his eyes drift to the back wall, where the colonel stood as if to say, "You see?" And Maya said nothing. She just watched the clock. At the 18-minute mark, the first thing happened, and it was so small that only 2 people in the room noticed it. One was Emily Parker, whose readout at Sector 9 ticked upward by a fraction of delay, so tiny it wouldn't have mattered any other day. The other was Maya, who saw Emily's shoulders go rigid across the room. At the 20-minute mark, the northern route lost sync. It didn't crash. It didn't alarm. It just quietly stopped being real-time. The forward units on the northern ridge kept receiving orders, but the orders were 4 seconds old, then 6, then 9. And in a combat simulation, that meant they were maneuvering against an enemy that had already moved. At 22 minutes, a young lieutenant named Ross, the same lieutenant Maya had watched get waved off earlier, leaned toward his screen and frowned. "Sir," he called out, "Northern units are reporting delayed acknowledgement." "How delayed?" Caldwell said, not turning. 9 seconds, sir, and climbing." Caldwell waved a hand. "Relay hiccup. It'll clear." At 25 minutes, it did not clear. At 27 minutes, the northern supply route lost contact with its lead element entirely, and a marker that had been green for 27 minutes turned yellow, and then 3 seconds later, red. "Sir," Ross's voice was higher now, "we've lost the lead northern element. No comms. They're moving blind." And now Caldwell turned. "What do you mean we lost them?" "Sector 9 relay, sir. The latency spiked past threshold. Everything running through it is stacking delays. The northern route is desynchronized." Ross swallowed. "And it's cascading. It's hitting the units behind them now, too." For the first time all morning, something crossed Admiral Caldwell's face that had no business being there. Doubt. "Reroute through the secondary path," he said. Ross's fingers moved, then stopped, then moved again. And then he looked up with an expression Maya recognized because it was the expression of a man discovering a truth someone tried to tell him 4 days ago. "Sir Chair," Ross said quietly, "there is no secondary path. The northern route only runs through Sector 9. There's no redundancy." The command center went very still, and in that stillness, one voice, quiet without triumph, spoke from the back wall. 20 minutes after the exercise begins, Maya said, "Your supply route will collapse. I believe that's what I told you at 0756. Caldwell's head snapped toward her. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other across the room. 40 years of certainty against 4 days of ignored warnings, and every officer on the floor held their breath. "Fix it," Caldwell barked at Ross, tearing his eyes away. Get me those units back, now. But the problem with a room that has been trained to stay silent is that when it finally needs to speak, it has forgotten how. Officers shouted over each other. Reports came in fast and contradicted each other. Someone tried to reroute traffic that couldn't be rerouted. Someone else called for a full relay reset that would take the entire northern grid offline for 4 minutes in the middle of a live exercise. The status board, which had been a wall of green for 27 minutes, began to bloom red like a wound spreading across skin. And Admiral Thomas Caldwell, the undefeated commander, the legend, the man who had never in his life failed to have an answer, stood at the center of it all and had no answer. He gave orders. The orders didn't work. He gave them louder. Louder didn't help because the problem had never once cared how loud he was. He looked at his screens and his officers and his beautiful collapsing operation, and for the first time in 20 years, the deep certainty that lived in his chest simply wasn't there. Emily Parker watched from her corner with her hands pressed flat against her station to keep them from shaking, and she thought, I told them. 4 days ago, I told them, and nobody heard it. And now it's happening, and I still can't say a word. Maya watched Caldwell. She watched the exact moment his pride finished burning down, and underneath it, she saw the thing she'd been waiting to see, the thing General Hayes had sent her here to find out whether it still existed in this man at all. Fear, real fear, not fear of losing the exercise. Fear that he had been wrong about something bigger than a relay. Fear that the record he'd built his whole identity on had been built on a room full of people who were too afraid to tell him the truth. That was the moment Maya had been waiting for, because a man who is afraid can finally learn. Caldwell turned slowly away from his screens, away from his shouting officers, away from the red spreading across the board. He turned toward the back wall, toward the woman he had called a brat 4 hours ago. And for a long, terrible, silent moment in front of 5,000 soldiers and 50 senior officers, and every man who had chuckled at his joke, Admiral Thomas Caldwell looked at Colonel Maya Anderson. And she looked back, and she did not gloat, and she did not smile, and she did not say a single word. She just waited, because she knew what it cost him, what she was about to make him do, and she was not going to make it 1 ounce heavier than it already was. The whole room felt it coming. 50 officers stood frozen, watching their admiral, watching the woman, understanding, without being told that they were about to witness something none of them had ever seen. They had seen Caldwell command. They had seen him win. They had never once seen him need anyone. Caldwell's jaw worked. The muscle in his cheeks stood out. You could see the war on his face, 40 years of I have all the answers grinding against the red wall of screens telling him he didn't. And then, in a voice that was quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard him use, Admiral Thomas Caldwell said 2 words, Colonel Anderson. The command center did not breathe. Maya pushed off the wall. She took 1 step forward. Sir. Caldwell's throat moved. The next words were the hardest words he had spoken in a decade, and everyone watching knew it, and the knowing made the silence heavier still. Do you, he said, have a recommendation? And there it was. The legend had asked, the undefeated man had asked, the commander who owned this floor had turned to the youngest, greenest, least decorated officer in the room, the one he'd laughed at, the one he'd tried to throw out, and he had asked her for help in front of everyone. Nobody laughed now. Nobody looked away now. Maya walked toward the tactical table, and the crowd of officers who had smiled at her humiliation 4 hours earlier parted for her without a word, stepping back, making room the way a room makes room for the one person who might know the way out. She reached the table. She looked at the collapsing map. She looked at the red spreading north. And then she did the thing that was the whole reason General Hayes had chosen her over a dozen more decorated officers. She did not give an order. She turned to the room full of frightened, silent, capable people, and she asked a question. Who Maya said actually knows what's wrong. Silence. The officers looked at each other. Nobody moved, because in this room for 4 years, knowing what was wrong had been dangerous, and the habit of silence does not break in a single moment. Maya's eyes moved across the floor past the colonels, past the majors, past the captains, all the way to the back corner to a young specialist with her hands pressed flat against her station. Specialist Parker, Maya said, and her voice carried across the whole command center. You reported this 4 days ago. Come here. Every head in the room turned toward the corner. Emily Parker froze. 5,000 soldiers, 50 officers, and the Admiral himself all suddenly looking at her, the specialist nobody ever looked at, and for one heartbeat, every instinct she'd built over 5 years screamed at her to say nothing, to disappear, to be small. And then she looked at the colonel, and the colonel gave her the smallest nod. Not an order. Permission. The permission she had waited 5 years to be given. Emily Parker stood up. And on shaking legs in front of the entire command of Fort Liberty, the specialist nobody had ever listened to walked toward the tactical table, toward the Admiral, who had never known her name, toward the woman who had crossed a crowded floor 40 minutes early, just to ask her what she was afraid to say. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to change everything. Emily Parker reached the tactical table, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. She was standing 3 feet from Admiral Thomas Caldwell, closer than she had ever been to him in 5 years. And up close, he looked older than he did from across the room, and more tired, and the red glow of the failing status board painted both their faces the same color. 50 officers watched her. 5,000 soldiers watched through the feeds. And Emily Parker, 26 years old, who had learned better than anyone at Fort Liberty how to be invisible, stood in the most visible place in the entire building. "Specialist," Maya said quietly, and her voice was an anchor. "Not to him, not to me. Just tell the room what's happening." Emily looked at the map, and something strange happened when she looked at the map. The fear was still there, sitting heavy in her chest, but underneath the fear was something she had almost forgotten she had. She knew this. She knew this better than anyone in the building. She had watched Sector 9 for 3 days. She had run the numbers 3 times. This was hers. "The Sector 9 relay is stacking latency," she said, and her voice shook on the first word and then steadied on the second. "It's not broken. That's what nobody understood. It's not broken. It's overloaded. Every unit on the northern route is talking through one relay, and that relay has a ceiling, and we crossed the ceiling at the 20-minute mark when all the units went active at once. The delay isn't going to clear on its own. It's going to get worse every minute we leave everything running through it." "So reset it," Caldwell said. "You can't reset it, sir." Emily said it fast before the fear could stop her. "A reset takes 4 minutes, and during those 4 minutes, the entire northern grid goes dark, and you'll lose every unit up there, not just the lead element. If you reset now in the middle of this, you don't fix the collapse. You finish it." A murmur went through the officers. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue because, for the first time, he was hearing something that sounded like the actual truth instead of something that sounded like a good report. "Then what?" he said, and it wasn't a challenge, it was a question. "If I can't reset it, what?" Emily opened her mouth, and then she stopped. Because the next part wasn't hers, the next part was above her. She knew what was wrong. She didn't know how to fix 5,000 soldiers. She looked at Maya, and Maya stepped in smooth and calm, the way you catch something for someone whose arms are already full. "You don't fix the relay," Maya said to the room. "You stop needing it. Specialist Parker just told us the problem is that everything runs through one path. So we stop running everything through one path." She looked up. "Who here works the southern grid?" A hand went up near the middle of the room. A staff sergeant, mid-30s, cautious. "That grid's underused right now, isn't it?" Maya said. "The southern route is quiet. The exercise didn't push much traffic through it." "That's right, ma'am," the staff sergeant said slowly. "It's running at maybe 30%. Then it's got capacity." Maya turned to Ross, the lieutenant who'd raised the first alarm. "Lieutenant, can you split the northern traffic, push the forward unit's comms across the southern grid instead of Sector 9? Not a reset, just a reroute. Take the load off the broken path by using the empty one." Ross's fingers were already moving. Then they stopped, and his face fell. "I can't authorize a cross-grid reroute, ma'am," he said. "That's a command-level action. It has to come from the Admiral." Every eye in the room swung to Caldwell. Done. And here was the second test, and it was harder than the first, and everyone felt it. Because the first test had only cost Caldwell his pride. This one cost him something worse. This one required him to take a plan built by a specialist he'd never noticed, and a colonel he'd tried to throw out and stake his entire operation on it in front of everyone in real time with no way to take it back. Caldwell looked at the map. He looked at the red. He looked at Emily Parker, this young woman he had commanded for 5 years, and could not have picked out of a lineup an hour ago. "If I authorize this reroute," he said slowly, And you're wrong. I lose the southern grid too. I lose everything. Not half. Everything. Yes, sir, Maya said. That's true. You're not going to soften that for me. No, sir, I'm not. Maya held his gaze. You've had people softening things for you for 4 years. That's how you ended up here, Ma. I'm not going to do it now. The words hit him. You could see them hit him. And somewhere in the tired face of the old admiral, something moved, some old thing from before he was a legend, from back when he was a young officer who used to trust his gut about people. He turned to Ross. Do it, Caldwell said. Reroute the northern traffic through the southern grid. My authorization. Now. Ross's hands flew, and for 90 seconds, nobody in the command center breathed. The status board hung there red and burning, and the officers watched the screens the way you watch a heart monitor. And Emily Parker stood frozen with her fists clenched, and Maya watched not the board but Caldwell. And Caldwell watched the board like a man watching a coin he'd flipped hang in the air. Then the first marker flickered. The lead northern element, the one they'd lost, the one moving blind for the last 9 minutes. Its marker had been red, and now as the southern grid picked up its traffic and the delay collapsed from 9 seconds to 4 to 1, the marker flickered and steadied and turned yellow. Contact restored on the lead element, Ross said, and his voice cracked. Sir, we have them back. Latency dropping. We have them back. A sound went through the room, a low, involuntary sound, 50 people exhaling at once. But Maya didn't move and she didn't smile because she was watching the board and she saw what the officers celebrating hadn't seen yet. It's not over, she said sharply. Look at the second wave. The room's attention snapped back to the screens. She was right. The lead element was back, but the units behind it, the ones that had started stacking delay in the last few minutes, were still red, and the southern grid, now carrying its own load, plus the rescued northern traffic, was climbing toward its own ceiling. We traded one overload for another, Maya said. The southern grid can't hold all of it. Specialist Parker, how long? Emily's eyes were already on the numbers. 4 minutes, she said. Maybe 5. Then the southern grid crosses its own ceiling, and we're right back where we started, except now both grids are stacking. The relief in the room curdled into something colder. Caldwell's face went hard again. So we bought 5 minutes. What do we do with 5 minutes? And Maya turned to the room and she asked the question again. The question that was the whole reason she'd been sent here, the question this command had forgotten how to answer. Who knows this system better than the people at this table? She said. Somebody in this room knows something we don't. Somebody's been quiet. Right now is the time to stop being quiet. Silence. And then from the back, a voice. I do. Every head turned. It was the staff sergeant from the southern grid, the cautious one, and he had gone pale and he looked like a man about to jump off something high. Say it, Maya said. There's a third grid, the staff sergeant said. The Eastern Relay Array. It's not in the exercise plan. It got decommissioned on paper 18 months ago because Command wanted to consolidate everything through the northern and southern paths, but it was never actually shut down. The hardware's still live. I know because I'm the one who was supposed to pull the cables and I never got the order to finish, so I didn't. He swallowed. If somebody with command authority reactivates it, you've got a third path. You split the load 3 ways instead of 2. Nobody crosses their ceiling. The room went electric, but Caldwell's face had gone dark and Maya saw it, and she understood why before anyone said a word. You're telling me, Caldwell said slowly, that a full relay array on my base was decommissioned on paper 18 months ago, and it's been running live and unmonitored this whole time, and nobody told me. The staff sergeant's face said everything. Who ordered the decommission? Caldwell asked. And now the staff sergeant looked like he wished he'd stayed quiet. Colonel Briggs, sir, he said. Something passed across the room, a ripple. Colonel Briggs was Caldwell's operations officer, his right hand, the man who managed the base's infrastructure and signed off on its readiness reports and stood at Caldwell's shoulder in every briefing. Briggs was standing in the room right now near the front, and every eye that had been on the staff sergeant now slid toward him. Caldwell turned. Briggs, is this true? Colonel Briggs was a smooth man, and he stayed smooth even now. Sir, the Eastern Array was redundant. Consolidation was the right call. It streamlined our comms footprint, and it looked cleaner on the readiness reports, which is what Command wanted. He spread his hands. The paper decommission was a formality. The hardware staying live was an oversight at the maintenance level, not a command decision. It was an oversight that's about to save this exercise, Maya said quietly. So let's be grateful for it. But sir, we have about 3 minutes now, not 4. Whatever you're going to do, do it. Caldwell looked at Briggs for one more second, and there was something in that look, something that filed the moment away for later, and then he turned back to the table. Sergeant, he said to the man from the southern grid, can you bring the Eastern Array online? Not alone, sir. I need the array's access codes, and they're locked to the operations office. Everyone looked at Briggs. Briggs hesitated. It was just a half second, but Maya saw it and Caldwell saw it, and in a room this tense, a half second was a scream. Of course, Briggs said smoothly, moving to a terminal. Coming right up. He entered the codes. The Eastern Array flickered to life on the board, a whole grid that wasn't supposed to exist, glowing green in the middle of the disaster. Split the load 3 ways, Maya said. Now. Ross and the staff sergeant worked in tandem, and the traffic redistributed. And this time the room watched with a different kind of tension, because this time they were watching to see if it would hold. The northern markers, red and yellow and choking, began to change. One by one, the units came back online. The delays dropped. The stacking latency, which had been building relentlessly for the better part of 10 minutes, finally broke and fell 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1, and then real time. The status board, which had been a spreading wound of red, began to close. Red to yellow, yellow to green. Slowly, unit by unit, the operation that had been dying began impossibly to breathe. Northern route stabilizing, Ross said, and now his voice was full of something that hadn't been in it all morning, hope. All grids holding under ceiling. Latency nominal across the board. Sir, we're recovering. The command center didn't cheer. It was too stunned to cheer. 50 officers stood watching a disaster reverse itself, and the thing they were feeling was too big and too strange for cheering. Maya stepped back from the table. You've got it from here, she said. It's your operation, Admiral. Finish the exercise. And she walked back toward the wall. But Caldwell wasn't looking at the board anymore. He was looking at her, and then at Emily Parker, and then at the empty air where the answers had come from, and something was happening on his face that 50 officers had never seen there before. He was doing math, not tactical math, a different kind. He was counting up all the times in the last 4 years that the truth had probably been standing in this room 40 minutes early with shaking hands, and he had walked right past it because it came from someone he decided not to hear. He didn't say anything, but Maya saw the number land. The exercise ran another 40 minutes, and it ran clean. The northern route held. The units advanced. The recovery held all the way to the exercise's scheduled end, and when the simulation finally closed and the screens went to their debrief state, the results that populated were not the flawless results Caldwell was used to seeing. They were mixed. The lead northern element had taken heavy simulated losses in the 9 minutes it spent blind. The timeline had slipped. In the cold accounting of the exercise, Fort Liberty had not won. For the first time in 4 years, the board did not say what Caldwell wanted it to say. And Caldwell stood there and looked at it, and every officer in the room braced because they knew what came next when the Admiral saw a bad result. They knew the tone he took. They knew who got blamed and how loudly. But Caldwell didn't do any of that. He just looked at the mixed result, the real result, the honest result, for a long moment. And then he said quietly to no one and to everyone, "That's the first true readout this command center has produced in a very long time." The officers didn't know what to do with that. Maya did. Maya understood exactly what she was watching. She was watching a man look at his own failure without flinching, maybe for the first time in his career, and choose not to reach for someone to blame it on. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. "Colonel Anderson," Caldwell said, turning to her. "My office, now." The room tensed again. Old habits. In the old Fort Liberty, my office now was where careers went to die. But Maya just nodded. "Yes, sir." And as she followed him off the floor, she caught Emily Parker's eye one last time, and she gave the young specialist a look that said, "You did that. Remember that you did that." Emily Parker sat back down at her station with her hands still trembling, but they were trembling for a different reason now, and she couldn't stop the tears standing in her eyes, and she didn't try. Caldwell's office door closed, and the two of them were alone. For a moment, neither spoke. Caldwell walked to his window and stood with his back to her, and Maya waited because she had learned a long time ago that when a proud man is about to say something hard, you give him the room to find it. "You let it break," Caldwell said finally. He didn't turn around. You could have come to me at 0757. You had the specialist's data. You had Hayes's authority. You could have stopped it before it started. He turned now and his eyes were sharp. You let 5,000 of my soldiers watch it fail on purpose. Yes, sir, Maya said. I did. She didn't dress it up. She didn't apologize. And Caldwell, who had expected her to squirm, studied her instead. Why, he said. Because a warning wouldn't have taught you anything, Maya said. I've written a lot of leadership evaluations, Admiral, and I've learned that some commanders can hear the truth in a briefing and some commanders can only feel it in a failure. If I'd stopped that exercise at 0757, you'd have spent the rest of the day certain that your relay would have held that I was a jumpy observer looking for problems that Hayes sent a kid to second-guess a legend. You'd have gone right back to running a command where a specialist warning dies in a log file because the sergeant above her decided the truth was insubordination. Maya's voice stayed level. I couldn't teach you that with a warning. I could only teach you that with a wound. So I gave you the wound. It was a simulation. Nobody died. But you'll feel it for a long time, and that feeling is the only thing that was ever going to change this base. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. That's a hell of a gamble, he said, with my career, with my record. Your record was already a lie, Maya said, and she said it gently, but she said it. That's why Hayes sent me. 4 years of flawless reports out of a command that size. He's been around long enough to know that clean isn't excellence. It's fear. It's a place where nobody reports a problem because the reports all come back green, whether they're true or not. Your record wasn't a record of a great command, Admiral. It was a record of a quiet one. And there's a difference, and today, 5,000 soldiers watch the difference. The words should have made Caldwell furious, and for a second, Maya could see that they almost did. 40 years of pride is not undone in an afternoon, and there was a part of the old admiral that wanted to throw her out of his office and call Hayes and demand a real evaluator, a respectful one who would look at his record and see what everyone else had always seen. But there was another part, a part that had stood at that table an hour ago with no answer, and had turned and had asked a colonel he'd called a brat for help, and had watched a specialist he'd never noticed save his operation. That part won, barely, but it won. Caldwell sat down heavily behind his desk. Tell me about Parker, he said. Maya blinked. It was the last thing she'd expected him to ask. Specialist Emily Parker, she said. 5 years at this base. She caught the Sector 9 problem 3 days ago, ran the numbers 3 times, reported it in writing to Master Sergeant Doyle 4 days before the exercise. Maya paused. He told her the relay had been fine for 6 years and to log it and move on. So she logged it. And she moved on. And she spent 4 days knowing your operation was going to fail and being too afraid to say it twice. Caldwell's face darkened. Doyle sat on it. Doyle did exactly what your command trained him to do, Maya said. That's the part I need you to understand, sir. Doyle isn't a bad sergeant. He's a product. In a command where problems make you a target, a smart sergeant learns to make problems disappear. He wasn't protecting the relay. He was protecting himself from you. She let that sit. Every silent soldier in that room today learned to be silent somewhere. And they all learned it in the same place. Caldwell looked at his hands. From me, he said. From the culture you built, Maya said. Which is the same thing, sir. You just don't like hearing it that way. And there it was. The whole truth laid on the desk between them. No softening, no cushion, exactly the thing Caldwell had spent 4 years making sure nobody ever said to his face. He waited to feel angry. He was surprised to find that mostly what he felt was tired. And underneath the tired, something that had been buried a long time, something that felt almost like relief. Because a part of him, a part he'd never admitted to, had known. Every commander knows somewhere when the reports are too good. He'd known. And he'd let himself not know, because knowing meant work and unknowing meant winning. And winning had always been easier. There's something else, Maya said, and I need you to hear this one carefully because it's not about culture. It's about a person. Caldwell looked up. The Eastern Array, Maya said, the one that got decommissioned on paper 18 months ago and stayed live. The one that saved you today. She held his eyes. Sir, that was luck. If that hardware had actually been shut down like the paperwork said, you'd have had no third path, and the southern grid would have crossed its ceiling, and the whole operation would have collapsed with no way back. You didn't survive today because you had redundancy. You survived because a maintenance sergeant never finished pulling a cable. Caldwell had already been thinking about this. She could see he had. "Briggs," he said. "Colonel Briggs decommissioned a functioning relay array to make the readiness reports look cleaner," Maya said. His words near enough. "Consolidated the comms footprint so it looked better on paper. That's not just bad judgment, sir. That's a man who understood that this command rewarded clean reports over honest ones, and he gave you clean reports. He removed a backup because a backup you never use looks like waste, and waste looks bad in a briefing." She paused. "He optimized for exactly what you rewarded, and today it almost cost you everything, and the only reason it didn't is that somebody down at the sergeant level quietly disobeyed him." Caldwell was very still. "You're telling me my operations officer stripped the redundancy out of my base to make me look good?" "I'm telling you your operations officer did what your command rewards," Maya said. "I'm not accusing Briggs of anything a lot of your officers wouldn't have done in his place. That's the point. That's what scares me about this base, Admiral. It's not one bad officer. It's a whole command that learned the same lesson, which is that looking good and being ready are the same thing here right up until the day they aren't." Caldwell stood up slowly and walked back to the window. "When I was a lieutenant," he said, and his voice was different now, lower further away. "I had a battery sergeant who used to chew me out in front of my own men when I got something wrong. Humiliated me. I hated him." He was quiet a moment. "Best officer I became because of him. Because he wasn't afraid of me. Because he told me the truth in a voice loud enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't hear it." He turned. "I don't have a single officer on this base who would do that. Not one. And I never once asked myself why. Because you stopped being able to hear it," Maya said quietly. "Somewhere between lieutenant and admiral, the truth got quieter and quieter, and you thought it was because things were going well. It wasn't. It was because you were getting louder and everyone else was learning to duck." The silence stretched, and then Caldwell did something that would have been unimaginable to every officer standing on the floor outside that door. "What do I do?" he asked. "Not for your report. I don't care about your report. What do I actually do, Colonel?" And Maya understood that the evaluation was over. Because the question Hayes had sent her to answer was never whether Caldwell was a good commander. His record answered that, or seemed to. The question Hayes had really been asking, the question underneath the question, was whether Thomas Caldwell was still capable of learning. Whether there was a man under the legend or just a monument. Whether if you finally forced him to fail in front of everyone and stripped away the record and showed him the fear his command was built on, he would reach for someone to blame or reach for the work. And he had just reached for the work. "You start tomorrow morning," Maya said. "Not with a speech. Speeches are how commanders make themselves feel better without changing anything. You start by walking down to the communications floor and you find Specialist Parker and you sit down next to her and you ask her to show you everything she's ever tried to report and been ignored on. Not to fix it all today, just to listen. Just so that one soldier on this base learns that a warning delivered to command doesn't disappear into a log file." Maya paused. "You do that in front of people, sir, on purpose, because the same way they all learn to be silent by watching you, they'll learn to speak by watching you too. Culture goes down from the top. It's the only direction it's ever gone." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said, "when you walked into my briefing this morning, I thought you were the most arrogant young officer I'd ever met." "I know," Maya said. "I called you a brat." "You did," loudly. A small thing moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. 5,000 people heard it, sir. It's probably going to be in my report." And Admiral Thomas Caldwell, the legend, the undefeated commander, the man who had not laughed at himself in 20 years, put his head back and let out a breath that was almost a laugh, a real one this time, tired and rueful and human. "Put it in the report," he said. "God knows I earned it." He walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the handle and he turned back to her, and his face was serious again. "The Eastern Array," he said. "Briggs, what you told me about the reports being cleaned up. That's not a culture problem, Colonel. That's the kind of thing that gets people killed when it isn't a simulation." His eyes had gone hard, but not at her. At something past her, something he was only now letting himself see. How deep does that go on this base? How many reports got cleaned up before they reached me? How many backups got pulled to make a footprint look neat? How many green lights on my board are actually green? Maya met his eyes. That, sir, she said, is the real evaluation. And I don't have the answer yet, but I know exactly where to start looking. And I don't think you're going to like where it leads. Caldwell held her gaze. Show me anyway, he said. And he opened the door and the two of them walked back out onto the command floor, where 50 officers were still standing in loose, uncertain clusters, waiting to find out what their world was going to look like now, watching their admiral and the young colonel come out of that office side by side instead of one of them in disgrace. And not one of those officers understood yet that the exercise that had just ended was not the test at all. The test was about to begin. The next morning at 06:30, before the base was fully awake, Admiral Thomas Caldwell walked onto the communications floor carrying 2 cups of coffee, and the room stopped breathing. Nobody had told them he was coming. Commanders like Caldwell did not come to the communications floor. When they wanted something from comms, they sent for it, and it arrived, and if it arrived wrong, someone got chewed out. In 5 years, the closest most of these soldiers had ever come to the Admiral was watching him cross the parade ground at a distance. And now here he was in the flesh at 6:30 in the morning, holding 2 coffees like a man who had no idea where to put his hands. Emily Parker was at her station. She had come in early the way she always did because early meant fewer people, and fewer people meant less chance of doing something that got noticed. She looked up and saw the Admiral walking toward her, and every drop of blood in her body went cold. Her first thought was that she was being relieved. That was how her mind worked after 5 years. A commander walking toward you personally meant you had done something wrong, and the something she had done wrong was obvious, wasn't it? She had stood up in front of the whole command yesterday. She had made the operations look bad. She had said out loud to the Admiral's face that she'd reported a problem 4 days early and been ignored. That was insubordination dressed up as helpfulness, and now the bill was coming due. She stood up so fast her chair rolled back and hit the wall. Sir, she said. Specialist Parker, sir. I know who you are, Caldwell said. Sit down, Specialist. Please. The please landed on the floor like a dropped plate. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind her, Emily heard another soldier's chair creak as they turned to watch. She sat, slowly, like the chair might be rigged. Caldwell pulled an empty chair from the next station over, and he set it down beside hers, and he sat in it, which put him lower than he should have been, and closer than he should have been, and he placed one of the coffees on her desk. I don't know how you take it, he said. I guessed. There's cream and sugar in it. If you drink it black, I apologize. Emily looked at the coffee. She looked at the Admiral. She could not have been more disoriented if he had sat down and started speaking a foreign language. Sir, she said, am I in trouble? And something crossed Caldwell's face when she asked that some flash of understanding about exactly how much damage his command had done, that a soldier's first assumption when her commander brought her coffee was that she was about to be punished. No, Caldwell said, you're not in trouble. You're the reason we're all standing here this morning instead of writing up the worst exercise in the history of this base. He paused and then he made himself say the next part because he had promised the colonel he would and because he had lain awake most of the night and decided she was right. I came down here to ask you something, Specialist, and I want you to answer me honestly, and I want you to know that nothing you say is going to come back on you. That's not a hope. That's an order. I'm ordering you to tell me the truth, and I'm ordering that no one can touch you for it. Emily's hands were shaking around the coffee cup. Ask me what, sir? Show me everything, Caldwell said. Every problem you have ever tried to report on this floor and had ignored. Every warning you logged that died in a file. Every time something are wrong and we're told to log it and move on. He looked at her and his voice was quiet and steady. 5 years, you said. Show me 5 years. I want to see what my command has been throwing away. For a moment, Emily didn't move. And then because a full colonel had ordered her to and an admiral was sitting beside her waiting, she turned to her terminal and she opened her logs and her hands were trembling so hard it took her 3 tries to type her password. What she pulled up made the admiral go very quiet. It wasn't one warning. It wasn't a handful. It was dozens. Report after report going back years. Each one logged in the careful, hopeful language of a young soldier who still believed that logging a thing meant somebody would fix it, and each one closed out with the same flat notation from whatever sergeant had received it. Noted, no action required. Closed, log and monitor, not a command priority. There was the Sector 9 latency ceiling reported not 4 days ago, but the first time 11 months ago, when Emily had first noticed the relay running hot under a smaller load. Noted, no action required. There was a report about a backup generator on the northern grid that hadn't passed a real load test in 2 years, only a paper inspection. Closed. There was a report about the eastern array of all things filed by Emily 14 months ago, flagging that the decommissioned hardware was still drawing power and still lived. And wasn't that either a security concern or a documentation error? Not a command priority. Caldwell read that one twice. You reported the eastern array, he said slowly. 14 months ago, you told this command it was live when the paperwork said it was dead. Yes, sir. And they closed it. Not a command priority. He looked at her. Specialist, that array saved us yesterday. If somebody had actually acted on your report 14 months ago and shut it down properly, we'd have collapsed. The only reason we lived is that they ignored you. He said it slowly, tasting how backward it was. Your command saved itself by ignoring you the right way by accident one time out of dozens. Emily didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Caldwell kept scrolling, and the further he scrolled, the more his jaw tightened, and it was not tightening at Emily. Somewhere around the 20th ignored report, he stopped scrolling and just sat there looking at the screen, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rough. Who closed these, he said, the notations? Who signed off on noted no action required? Give me name specialist, not to punish anybody. I need to understand the shape of it. Emily hesitated. This was the part that could hurt her, naming sergeants to an admiral. But he'd ordered honesty, and she'd run out of the strength it took to be careful. Most of them are Master Sergeant Doyle, sir. He's my section chief. He closes most of the comms floor reports. She scrolled. But some of them go higher. When something's flagged as involving other departments, it kicks up to the operations office for a determination. Those ones, she pointed, those ones are closed by the operations officer. Caldwell had leaned in. The closing notation on the Eastern Array report, the one that had marked a live unauthorized relay array as not a command priority 14 months ago, carried a name. Colonel Briggs. Caldwell sat back slowly. And Emily, watching his face, understood that she had just shown the Admiral something he had not come down here expecting to find. She'd thought this was about her, about clearing herself, about surviving. It wasn't. She had just handed Thomas Caldwell the first thread of something much larger, and she could see him take hold of it, and she could see him start very deliberately to pull. Specialist Parker, Caldwell said, I want you to do something for me, and I want you to understand it's a lawful order, and it's going to protect you, not expose you. I want you to compile every report you've filed in 5 years, and every closing notation, and who signed each one. Package it, timestamp it, and send it to exactly 2 people. Me and Colonel Anderson. Nobody else? Not Doyle, not the operations office. Can you do that? Emily's throat was dry. Yes, sir, but sir, if Colonel Briggs finds out I sent his name up the chain. And this was the moment. Caldwell heard the fear in it, the old 5-year fear, the fear that telling the truth about a powerful man was a death sentence, and he understood that if he wanted this base to change, this was where it changed, right here, with one frightening specialist and one honest answer. Specialist, go up, Caldwell said, and he said it loud enough that the whole floor could hear it loud enough that it was clearly meant for the whole floor. Yesterday you saved 5,000 soldiers because you finally said something true out loud. And the only reason it took you 4 days to say it is that this command taught you that the truth was dangerous. That was my failure, not yours. I'm the one who built a place where a specialist sits on a warning for 4 days because she's more afraid of her own command than she is of the mission failing. He looked around the room at the dozen soldiers who had stopped pretending not to listen. That ends today. In front of all of you. Anybody who comes after Specialist Parker for telling me the truth comes after me. And I have not lost a fight in 40 years. The floor was dead silent. And then slowly from a station 3 down, an older comm sergeant started to clap. Just once, then, again, and then the whole floor was doing it, this awkward, disbelieving building, applause soldiers who had never in 5 years seen a commander take their side, Watching it happen, watching the Admiral, who'd called a colonel a brat yesterday, sit at a specialist desk and offer to fight anyone who touched her. Emily Parker put her hand over her mouth, and the tears she'd been holding since yesterday finally came. Caldwell stood up. He picked up his own coffee, which he hadn't touched. "Compile the package, specialist," he said quietly. "2 people, me and the colonel, and Parker." He stopped. "Thank you. It's 5 years late, but thank you." And he walked off the communications floor, and behind him the room was buzzing in a way it hadn't buzzed in years, and Emily Parker turned to her terminal and began with steady hands, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to compile 5 years of ignored truth into one file that was about to change everything. Maya was waiting in the small office they'd given her when the package came through at 800. She opened it, and she read it, and she read it again, and then she sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath, because she had come to Fort Liberty expecting to find a culture problem, a soft rot, a command that had gotten too comfortable. She had not expected to find this, because the pattern in Emily Parker's 5 years of reports told a story, and it wasn't the story of a lazy command that ignored problems out of habit. It was more specific than that. It was more deliberate. When Maya laid the reports out by category and by who had closed them, a shape emerged, and the shape pointed in one direction. The reports Doyle closed were the small stuff: latency, a hot relay, a generator that needed a real test, genuine ignoring, genuine laziness. The ordinary rot of a command that had learned problems were unwelcome. But the reports that had kicked up to the operations office, the ones Briggs closed, those weren't random. Every single report Briggs had personally marked not a command priority touched the same thing: infrastructure that had been quietly decommissioned on paper, backups that had been eliminated to streamline the footprint, redundancies that had been stripped out, and every time Emily Parker had noticed one of those things and flagged it, Briggs had personally closed her report fast and buried it. It wasn't laziness, it was a cover. Maya pulled up the base's readiness reports, the ones Briggs prepared, and Caldwell signed and sent up to General Hayes every month, the flawless ones, the ones that had made Caldwell a legend. And she started matching them against Emily's ignored warnings, and her blood went cold. Because the readiness reports claimed full redundancy, they claimed backup systems that Emily's warnings said didn't exist anymore. They claimed a comms infrastructure with multiple independent paths when Emily had reported 11 months ago that the whole northern route funneled through a single relay. They claimed load-tested generators when Emily had flagged that the load tests were paper-only. Point by point, the reports Briggs sent to Hayes were describing a base that Emily Parker's warnings said had been hollowed out from the inside. Briggs hadn't been cleaning up reports to make Caldwell look good. Briggs had been stripping the base of its redundancies, pocketing whatever came from the consolidation and papering over the holes with fabricated readiness reports that Caldwell signed, without checking, because Caldwell had never in 4 years imagined his own right hand would lie to him. Maya sat very still, because this was the twist that changed everything, and she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders. She had been sent to evaluate Caldwell's leadership, and she had found underneath the leadership problem a much older and darker thing. She had found fraud, real fraud, the kind that gets a general court-martial, the kind that if the exercise yesterday had been real instead of a simulation would have gotten soldiers killed because the backups they thought they had would not have been there. And the thing that turned her stomach was this: Caldwell's terrible leadership hadn't just failed to catch the fraud, it had made the fraud possible. A command where nobody reported problems was the perfect place to hide missing redundancies. A command where truth died in a log file was the perfect place for a man like Briggs to work. Caldwell's fear culture and Briggs's fraud weren't two separate problems. They were one machine. Caldwell built the silence and Briggs lived in it. There was a knock. Caldwell opened her door without waiting for an answer. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. His face was gray. "You've seen it too," Maya said. Caldwell came in and shut the door. He didn't sit. He stood there like a man who'd been hit. "I signed those reports," he said. "Every month for 2 years. I signed readiness reports certifying redundancy I now know wasn't there. I sent them to Hayes with my name on them." His voice was hollow. "If yesterday had been real, Colonel, if those had been real units and real comms and real soldiers up on that northern ridge, they'd have died. They'd have died believing they had backups I certified. Because I signed a piece of paper without reading it, because I trusted a man who was robbing me blind, because I built a command where nobody would ever have dared tell me the paper was a lie. Sir, Maya said carefully, I need you to sit down because we have a decision to make, and it's a hard one and it can't wait. Caldwell sat. Briggs doesn't know we know, Maya said. As far as he's aware, yesterday was a comms glitch that got resolved, and the Eastern Array coming online was an embarrassing oversight that made him look sloppy, but nothing worse. He gave up the access codes yesterday because refusing would have looked guilty in the moment, and he's smart enough to know that. But he's had all night to think. And if he's as smart as I think he is, he's already realized that a live array he decommissioned on paper is a thread somebody could pull. So right now this morning, he is very likely deciding whether to clean up his tracks. Caldwell's eyes sharpened. Clean up how? The records, Maya said. The decommission orders. The consolidation paperwork. Anything that ties the missing redundancies to his signature. If Briggs gets an hour alone with the operations office archive, half of what we need to prove this is gone. Emily's reports show that he ignored the warnings, but the warnings alone aren't the crime. The crime is in the readiness reports, and the decommission orders the documents that show he knew the redundancy was gone and certified it present anyway. Those are in his shop, under his control, and every minute we sit here talking, he has the ability to start deleting them. Caldwell was already standing. Then we secure the operations office. Now, I'll relieve him and lock the archive. No, Maya said sharply, and Caldwell stopped. Sir, wait. If you march down there and relieve Briggs this morning, you tip him off, and worse, you do it with no proof secured and no authority above your own. Briggs has been sending fraudulent reports up the chain for 2 years. That's not a base-level matter anymore. The moment you relieve him, he lawyers up. He claims it was all a documentation error. He says you signed every report, so you're as culpable as he is, which, sir, on paper you are. And it becomes your word against his in a mess that swallows his whole command, including you, including me, including that specialist down on the comms floor who's now on record accusing a colonel. Maya leaned forward. We do this once and we do it right, or we don't do it at all. Caldwell stood there vibrating with the need to act, the old instinct to charge, and Maya watched him fight it down. Then what? He said. What do we do? We call Hayes, Maya said. This is exactly why he sent me. Not to evaluate whether you yell too much in briefings. He had a feeling. 2 years of flawless reports out of a command this size, and something in his gut said the reports were too clean to be true. He sent me to find out if there was a person under the legend who could handle the truth when it came. There is. You've proven that in 24 hours. She stood up too. But this is above both of us now. We secure the archive quietly under the cover of a routine post-exercise records review that gives us a legitimate reason to freeze everything Briggs can touch. And we get Hayes down here with the authority to relieve a colonel and the investigators to seize the documents before Briggs can destroy them. And we do all of it before Briggs realizes the ground has moved under him. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. You planned this, he said slowly. Not the fraud. You couldn't have known about the fraud. But this, letting me fail yesterday, coming down on the leadership, the culture, the silence. You needed me to actually change before you showed me any of this. Because if I hadn't changed, if I was still the man who walked into that command center yesterday morning, I'd be down in that operations office right now, backing Briggs, wouldn't I? I'd be defending him. Because he made me look good and you made me look bad. And yesterday morning, that was the only math I knew how to do. Maya didn't answer right away. Yesterday morning, she said finally, if I'd walked into your office with this file, you'd have called Briggs in, and Briggs would have told you it was a documentation error and a jealous specialist stirring up trouble, and you'd have believed him. Because he was your right hand, and I was a stranger, and Parker was a nobody. I couldn't hand you the truth until you were a man who could hear it. She met his eyes. So no, sir, I didn't plan the fraud, but I planned to find out whether you were still someone I could trust with what I found. And you passed. Barely. This morning, sitting at that specialist's desk, that's when you passed. If you'd sent for her instead of gone to her, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I'd be writing a very different report, and I'd be writing it to Hayes about you. The weight of that sat between them. Caldwell walked to the window. His shoulders, which had carried 40 years of certainty, looked heavy now, but not broken. Something in him had shifted from a man defending a monument to a man defending his soldiers, and Maya could see the difference from across the room. Make the call, Caldwell said. Hayes, right now, and Colonel. He turned. Whatever this costs me, my record, my rank, whatever's coming, and something is coming because I signed those reports and there's no version of this where I walk away clean. I signed them. That's on me forever. But whatever it costs me, we do it right. We protect Parker. We protect anyone who spoke up. And we make damn sure that the next time a soldier on my base sees something wrong, she doesn't sit on it for 4 days because she's scared. His jaw set. That's the only version of this I can live with. Maya reached for the secure line, but before her hand touched it, the phone on the desk rang first the internal line and the caller ID showed a name that made both of them go still. Operations Office. Colonel Briggs. Maya and Caldwell looked at each other. Caldwell picked it up. Caldwell. Maya couldn't hear the other side, but she watched the Admiral's face and she watched it change, and she watched something cold move into his eyes. Say that again, Caldwell said slowly. He listened. When he said, "How long ago?" he listened again, and then he set the phone down very gently, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd slammed it, and he looked at Maya and his voice was quiet and hard. "That was Briggs," he said, "calling to inform me as a courtesy that in light of yesterday's comms failure, he's initiated a full purge and rebuild of the operations archive, starting this morning, to, in his words, clear out corrupted and outdated records and give the command a clean baseline going forward." Caldwell's hands had curled into fists. "He started 20 minutes ago, Colonel. He's deleting it right now. And he called to tell me himself because he knows I signed every one of those reports, and he's betting that I'm smart enough to understand that if the records burn, they burn for both of us." The room went silent, and Maya Anderson stood up, and every trace of the patient evaluator was gone from her face. And what was left was the thing General Hayes had actually sent to Fort Liberty. "Then we're out of time," she said, "and we do this now." "Call Hayes," Maya said, already moving toward the door. "You make that call while you walk. Tell him exactly what's happening in one sentence, and tell him you need him to authorize an emergency records freeze on the operations office over the phone right now, before we lose it. I'm going to the operations floor to slow Briggs down." Caldwell was already dialing. "You're not going down there alone. He's deleting evidence of a felony. A man who'll do that is a man with nothing left to lose." "He has everything to lose," Maya said. "That's what makes him dangerous, and that's also what I can use. Make the call, Admiral. 2 minutes. That's all the head start I need to buy you." And she was gone. Maya moved down the corridor at a pace that wasn't quite a run, because a running colonel starts a panic, and a panic gives Briggs cover. But it was faster than anyone at Fort Liberty had ever seen her move. Her mind was working the whole way. A full archive purge and rebuild was an instant. Briggs had said 20 minutes. Deleting records with any thoroughness, overwriting them so they couldn't be recovered, took time, and the operations archive was large. He couldn't have gotten through all of it yet. He'd start with the most dangerous documents first. The decommission orders, the consolidation paperwork, the originals of the readiness data that contradicted what he'd sent up to Hayes. If she could reach the operations floor and stop the purge before he finished those, the case survived. If she was even 4 minutes too late, it didn't. At 0817, Maya pushed through the doors of the operations office. Colonel Briggs was at the central terminal, and 2 of his staff were at stations flanking him, and the moment Maya walked in, she read the whole room in a heartbeat. The 2 staffers looked nervous. Briggs looked calm. Too calm. The calm of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed in his head all night. "Colonel Anderson," Briggs said pleasantly, not stopping what his hands were doing. "You're a long way from the observation deck. Can I help you?" "Stop the purge, Colonel," Maya said. The 2 staffers froze. Briggs kept typing. "I'm afraid that's a command decision, and it's already been cleared with Admiral Caldwell. Yesterday's failure exposed a lot of corrupted records in this archive. I'm cleaning house." The Admiral agreed it was overdue. He smiled without looking up. "You're welcome to take it up with him." "I just left him," Maya said. "He's on the phone with General Hayes right now. And in about 90 seconds, you're going to get a call freezing every terminal in this room. So here's your choice, Colonel. You can stop now on your own, and that goes in the record as cooperation. Or you can keep deleting for the next 90 seconds, and every keystroke you make between now and that phone call becomes obstruction and destruction of evidence in a federal fraud investigation. 90 seconds. Choose carefully." For the first time, Briggs's hands paused, just for a second. But Maya saw it and she pressed into the gap. "You know what I found in Specialist Parker's 5 years of reports?" she said. "You know because you closed a third of them yourself. You marked a live unauthorized relay array, not a command priority 14 months ago because you were the one who decommissioned it, and the last thing you needed was somebody looking too hard at what happened to the hardware and the funding when it came off the books." She took a step closer. "The Eastern Array saved this base yesterday. Do you understand what that means for you, Colonel? The one piece of infrastructure you stripped out and hid is the one piece that lived because a sergeant never finished pulling the cable, which means it's still there, still running, still generating logs, still tied to your decommission order and your signature. You can burn every document in this archive, and that array is still sitting out there telling the whole story." Briggs's face had gone still. The two staffers were looking at him now, not at their screens. And Maya turned to them because they were the soft spot, they were the young officers who'd been told to help with a routine cleanup and were now hearing words like fraud and federal investigation. "You too," Maya said. "I want you to hear me clearly because your careers are about to fork right here in this room. You were told to help clean up an archive. Maybe you believe that, maybe you didn't ask. But the moment you understand that what you're deleting is evidence and you keep deleting it, you become part of it. So step away from the terminals right now, hands where I can see them. And this morning becomes a thing that happened to you instead of a thing you did." The staffer on the left stood up so fast his chair fell over. The one on the right hesitated, looked at Briggs, looked at Maya, and then stood up too. "Sit back down," Briggs snapped. "Don't," Maya said quietly. "Don't make it worse for them than you've already made it for yourself." And Colonel Briggs, cornered, calculating, made the decision that men like him always make when the calm runs out. He stopped playing the reasonable administrator, and he showed what was underneath. His hand moved toward the terminal, fast one final command, one last purge of the most damning file while he still could. Maya crossed the room. She didn't shout. She didn't grab him. She put one hand flat on the terminal over the port blocking it, and she put her face close to his, and she said 7 words in a voice so low that only he could hear them. "That array logged everything. It's already gone." Briggs looked at her. "You're lying," he said. "But it came out cracked. 14 months of continuous operational logs on a relay array you thought was dead," Maya said. "Time-stamped, independent of this archive. Pulled to a secure server an hour ago while you were writing your little courtesy speech about corrupted records. You could have burned this whole room to ash last night, and it wouldn't have mattered because the one system you were most sure was invisible has been watching you the entire time." She held his eyes. "It's over, Colonel. It's been over since the moment that cable didn't get pulled. Take your hand off the keyboard." It was a bluff, part of it anyway. Maya hadn't pulled the array logs an hour ago because an hour ago she hadn't known the fraud existed. But the array had been running for 14 months, and it did generate logs, and those logs did exist, and everything she'd said was true except the timing. And Briggs didn't know the timing. All Briggs knew was that the one thing he'd been certain was buried had just turned out to be alive, and that certainty had been the floor he was standing on, and Maya had just kicked it out. His hand came off the keyboard, and at 08:19 the phone on the central terminal rang. It didn't stop ringing. Every phone in the operations office rang at once, and the terminals all flickered and a system message bloomed across every screen in the room. "Archive locked by command authority. All right access suspended. Authorization Hazer LTG. Caldwell had made the call." Briggs stared at the frozen screen, and the last of the calm drained out of his face, and what was left was just a man who had run out of moves. The doors opened behind Maya. Admiral Thomas Caldwell walked in. He didn't storm in. He walked in slow, and he crossed the room, and he stopped in front of the man who had stood at his right shoulder for 4 years, the man who had made his readiness reports flawless, the man whose lies he had signed his own name to. And for a long moment, the two of them just looked at each other, and the whole room held its breath. 2 years, Caldwell said quietly. 2 years you handed me reports and I signed them because I trusted you, because you were good at making me look good, and I liked looking good more than I liked asking questions. His voice was steady, but there was something terrible under it. You didn't just rob the base, Briggs. You made me a liar to my own soldiers. Every one of them who thought they had backups they didn't have. Everyone who'd have died yesterday if it had been real. You put that on my signature." Tom Briggs started. "Tom, listen. It was consolidation. It was efficiency. You can't prove intent. You signed every—" "Don't." Caldwell's voice cut him off flat. "Don't tell me I signed them. I know I signed them. I'm going to spend the rest of my career answering for signing them. But here's the difference between you and me, Colonel. The difference that's going to matter when the investigators sort through all of this." He leaned in. "I signed them because I was a fool who trusted the wrong man and stopped reading what I put my name to. You wrote them because you knew they were lies. And a man can be forgiven for being a fool a lot easier than he can be forgiven for being a thief. You'd better get yourself a very good lawyer." He straightened up and turned to the two staffers standing frozen against the wall. "You two stepped away from the terminals when the colonel told you to." "Yes, sir," they said almost in unison. "Then you'll be witnesses, not defendants. Go stand in the hall. Touch nothing. Talk to no one until the investigators arrive." He looked at Briggs one last time. "Colonel Briggs, you're relieved. You're confined to quarters pending investigation. Escort's on its way. And if you touch another keyboard between now and then, I will personally make sure the word cooperation never appears in a single document about you for the rest of your life." The security detail arrived at 0824. Maya watched them walk Briggs out, and she watched the operations floor full of soldiers watch it too, this man who had run their infrastructure for 4 years being walked out under escort, and she saw on their faces the things she'd come to Fort Liberty to change. Shock, yes, but underneath the shock, something else. Something like relief. The relief of people who had felt for a long time that something was wrong and had learned it was safer not to say so, watching the wrongness finally get pulled out into the light. When the room had cleared, Caldwell sat down heavily in the chair Briggs had been sitting in, and he put his face in his hands for a moment, just a moment, and then he looked up at Maya. "The array logs," he said, "that you pulled an hour ago. You couldn't have. You didn't know about the fraud an hour ago." "No, sir," Maya said. "I didn't." Caldwell looked at her for a second, and then something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You bluffed him. You stood in front of a man destroying evidence, and you bluffed him off the keyboard with logs that don't exist yet." "They exist," Maya said. "The array's been running for 14 months. The logs are real. I just hadn't pulled them yet when I said I had. I'll pull them this afternoon, and they'll show everything I said they'd show because it's all true. I just moved the timeline up a couple of hours in the telling." She allowed herself the smallest breath of a smile. "He was never going to check my facts, sir. He was too busy watching the floor drop out from under the one thing he thought was safe. Fear does the same thing to everybody. It makes you stop thinking. I've spent my whole career watching commanders let fear run their rooms. I just used it on the man who deserved it most." Caldwell shook his head slowly. "Hayes said you were the best he had. I thought he was exaggerating." "I don't think he was exaggerating." "Hayes is coming," Maya said. "He's inbound now. He wants the archive secured, the array logs pulled and preserved, and Parker's report package locked down as the foundation of the investigation. And he wants to talk to you, sir. Personally." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend that conversation is going to be easy. You signed 2 years of fraudulent readiness reports. There's no version where that doesn't follow you. Hayes knows you didn't write to them, and he knows what you did in the last 24 hours to catch the man who did, and that's going to matter. But it's not going to erase your signature. You need to walk into that conversation ready for that." "I am ready for it," Caldwell said, and Maya believed him. "I've been ready for it since I sat down at that specialist desk this morning and watched her hands shake when I brought her a cup of coffee. That's when I understood what I'd built, a place where a soldier's hands shake because her commander is nice to her. I earned whatever's coming. I'm not going to hide from it. I'm going to help clean it up, and then I'm going to answer for my part, and I'm going to do it in front of every soldier on this base, because that's the only way any of them will ever believe the culture actually changed." Maya looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she stopped seeing the arrogant legend who'd called her a brat and started seeing the officer General Hayes had believed might still be in there somewhere. "Sir," she said quietly, "can I tell you something about the report I'm going to write?" "Tell me." "When Hayes sent me here, my job was to answer one question. Was Thomas Caldwell a great commander, or just a lucky one who'd built a command too scared to ever record a loss?" She held his eyes. And the honest answer, the one I'd have written if I'd left after that first briefing, is that you were the second one. You'd build a monument to yourself out of other people's silence, and it looked like excellence from a distance, and up close it was rotting. She paused. But that's not the report I'm going to write, because the question was never really about the man who walked into that command center yesterday. It was about the man who'd walk out of it. And the man walking out is somebody who let himself fail in front of 5,000 soldiers, sat down next to the lowest ranking person on his base and asked her to teach him what he'd been too proud to see, and then turned around and burned down his own right hand to protect his people. That man isn't lucky, Admiral. That man's the real thing. He just spent 20 years buried under the fake one. Caldwell didn't say anything for a while. I called you a brat, he said finally, in front of everyone. You did, sir? And you let me humiliate you, and you let my whole command watch it, and you never once fought back or pulled rank or told me who you were until I dug the hole so deep I couldn't climb out of it on my own. He shook his head slowly. You could have flattened me in that first briefing. One phone call to Hayes and I'd have been the fool who threw an official evaluator out of his own command center. You had that in your pocket the whole time, and you didn't use it. No, sir, Maya said, because flattening you wouldn't have fixed anything. Fort Liberty didn't need me to win a fight with its admiral. It needed its admiral to change. And you can't change a man by beating him. You can only change him by giving him a chance to change himself and then getting out of the way when he takes it. She paused. You took it, sir, faster than almost anyone I've ever evaluated. That's going in the report, too. At 900, General Robert Hayes's helicopter touched down at Fort Liberty, and the investigation began in earnest. By noon, the array logs were pulled and preserved, and they showed exactly what Maya had promised, 14 months of an unauthorized relay array running live, while the paperwork called it dead tight at the timestamp level to Briggs's decommission order, and the funding that had quietly walked off the books with it. By afternoon, Emily Parker's 5 years of reports had become the spine of a fraud case that would eventually reach far past Fort Liberty, because Briggs, it turned out, had not been acting entirely alone, and the consolidation scheme had touched 2 other installations, and the thread Emily Parker had pulled 14 months ago from her little corner of the communications floor unraveled something much larger than anyone had guessed. But that was for the investigators. That was for the months ahead. What mattered that afternoon happened in a small conference room where General Hayes sat across from Admiral Caldwell, and Maya stood by the wall, and Hayes laid it out plain. There would be an investigation into Caldwell's signatures. There would be consequences. His flawless record, the undefeated record, was finished, and it had been finished the moment he signed the first report he didn't read. That was real, and Hayes didn't soften it, and Caldwell didn't ask him to. But Hayes said the reason I sent Anderson instead of a formal audit team was because a formal audit team would have found the fraud, hung you for it, relieved you, and left. And this base would have gotten a new commander and the exact same culture, because the culture was never in the readiness reports. It was in the room, in the silence, in a specialist who sat on a warning for 4 days. Hayes leaned forward. Anderson tells me that in 24 hours you turned into a man who could run this base the right way. She's not easy to impress, Tom. I've known her a long time. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to answer for the reports fully and publicly. And if there's anything left of your career after that, I want you to spend it here fixing what you broke. Because a man who's finally learned the lesson is worth more than 10 men who never had to. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. Yes, sir, he said. Whatever's left of it, here, fixing it. And that evening, after Hayes had gone and the investigators had settled in and the base was quiet, Admiral Thomas Caldwell walked back down to the communications floor one more time. Emily Parker was still there. Of course she was. She was always the first in and the last out, 5 years of habit. Specialist, Caldwell said. She stood up, but her hands didn't shake this time. Sir, you reported that array 14 months ago, Caldwell said. You reported the relay 11 months ago. You reported the generators, the load tests, all of it, and every time this command told you to log it and move on. He looked at her. Every single thing that broke this open you saw first. Not me, not the colonel, you, a specialist that nobody on this base could have named a week ago. He paused. I came down here to ask you one more thing, and you can say no. Ask me, sir. When this investigation's over and we start rebuilding how this base handles a soldier's warning, I want you to help build it, not as a specialist filing reports into a void, as the person who designs the system that makes sure the next Emily Parker never has to sit on the truth for 4 days because she's scared. He held her eyes. You know better than anyone in this building what happens when a warning dies in a log file. I want you to make sure it never happens here again. Will you do that? Emily Parker looked at the Admiral who had called a colonel a brat 2 mornings ago. The man everyone on this floor had spent 5 years learning to fear standing in front of her, asking a specialist to help him rebuild his own command. And for the first time in 5 years, when she opened her mouth to speak to a senior officer, she wasn't afraid. Yes, sir, she said. I'll do that. 30 days later, Fort Liberty was not the same place, and everyone who lived there could feel it, even if none of them could have told you the exact moment it changed. Maya could have told them. She'd watched it happen. It hadn't been the day Briggs was walked out under escort, though that was the day everyone remembered. And it hadn't been the day General Hayes' helicopter landed, though that was the day everyone talked about. The real change had come quieter than any of that in 100 small moments over 30 days, and the first one had come the morning after Briggs's arrest, when a young lieutenant named Ross, the same one who'd raised the first alarm during the exercise, walked into the morning briefing and did something no one on that base had done in 4 years. He disagreed with the plan, out loud, in front of everyone. The room had frozen the way rooms at Fort Liberty always froze waiting for the axe. And Admiral Caldwell, standing at the front, had looked at the lieutenant for a long moment. And then he'd said, "Go on, Lieutenant. Walk me through it. Not how dare you, not who asked you. Just walk me through it." Ross had walked him through it, and he'd been right about part of it and wrong about part of it, and Caldwell had adjusted the plan for the part he was right about and explained the part he was wrong about without making him feel small for missing it. And the whole room had watched a thing happen that they'd been told their entire careers could not happen. A junior officer had questioned the commander, and the commander had listened, and the world had not ended. That was the morning Fort Liberty started to change. Not because of a speech, because of one lieutenant who took a risk, and one admiral who rewarded it instead of crushing it, and 40 officers who watched and understood that the rules had actually changed. Maya had watched it from the back of the room, and she'd felt something in her chest she didn't feel often in her line of work, which was hope. Because she'd evaluated a lot of commands and she'd written a lot of reports recommending a lot of changes, and she knew that most of the time, the changes didn't take. A base would clean up its act for a month while the evaluator was watching and then slide right back the moment she left. Culture was heavy. Culture wanted to stay the way it was. But this was taking. She could see it taking. The changes came steadily over those 30 days, and they came from everywhere, not just from the top. A new reporting system went in, and it was Emily Parker who designed it exactly as Caldwell had asked. It wasn't complicated. That was the point. Any soldier at any rank could file a concern, and the system routed it not just to their section chief, but to an independent review, so that a warning could never again die in a single sergeant's inbox, because that sergeant found it inconvenient. And every report got a response in writing within 72 hours, even if the response was just, "We looked at this, here's what we found." Because Emily had understood better than anyone that what broke a soldier's willingness to speak wasn't being told no. It was being told nothing. Master Sergeant Doyle, the man who'd told Emily to log it and move on, had expected to be relieved along with Briggs. He hadn't been. Maya had recommended against it, and Caldwell had agreed, and the reason was the same reason Maya had explained in his office 30 days earlier. Doyle wasn't a criminal. Doyle was a product. He'd learned to bury warnings in a command that punished warnings, and the man who'd built that command was the one who needed to answer for it, not the sergeant who'd survived it. So Doyle stayed. And a strange thing happened. Doyle, who had spent years being the wall that soldiers' concerns died against, became one of the loudest advocates for the new system. Because Doyle had never actually enjoyed being that wall. He just thought it was the only way to survive. When the survival math changed, so did he. That was the thing Maya had understood from the beginning, the thing that made her different from the audit teams who came in swinging axes. Most people at a broken command aren't villains. They're just people who did the math their environment gave them. Change the environment, and most of them change with it. The villains, the real ones, the Briggses are rare. What's common is the silence, and the silence is made of 1,000 ordinary people, all quietly deciding that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. Change that one equation, and you change everything. The investigation into Briggs widened exactly as Hayes had feared. The consolidation scheme had touched 2 other installations, and Briggs had not been the only officer involved, and by the end of that first month, there were 4 names under investigation across 3 bases, and the fraud they uncovered was measured in the millions, and more chillingly, in the redundancies stripped out of systems that soldiers depended on to stay alive. It was the kind of thing that in a war would have killed people. It was the kind of thing that had almost killed a simulation full of them. And all of it had started to unravel from one corner of one communications floor, from one specialist who'd noticed a relay running hot and been brave enough eventually to say so out loud. Emily Parker was promoted that month, not because of politics and not as a reward for loyalty, but because when the review board looked at what she'd caught and what she'd built, they couldn't find a reason not to. She made staff sergeant, and the promotion ceremony was small, and when they pinned her rank on her hands didn't shake, and Maya stood in the second row and watched and thought about the young woman whose hands had trembled so hard she couldn't type her password 30 days before. Caldwell answered for his signatures publicly the way he'd said he would. That was the hardest day, and Maya would remember it for a long time. He stood up in front of the assembled command, 5,000 soldiers, the same 5,000 who'd watched him call her a brat, who'd watched his operation collapse, who'd watched him turn to a young colonel and ask for help, and he told them the truth. He told them he had signed 2 years of readiness reports without reading them. He told them that those reports had certified backups that didn't exist, and that if the exercise had been real, soldiers under his command would have died believing they had protection he'd guaranteed them. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame Briggs, though Briggs deserved blame. He said the words that a commander almost never says. I failed you. Not because I meant to, because I stopped paying attention and I built a place where no one felt safe telling me I'd stopped. That's not Briggs's fault. That's mine. And I'm going to spend whatever's left of my time in this uniform making sure it never happens to any of you again. The formal proceedings ran their course over the following weeks. There were letters in his file, permanent ones, the kind that end any hope of another star. His undefeated record was gone, formally overturned, replaced in the official history by the truth, which was that Fort Liberty's flawless run had been built partly on fraud and partly on fear. Any other officer would have retired rather than serve under that shadow. Caldwell didn't retire. He'd made a promise to Hayes and a promise to his soldiers, and he stayed and he spent every day proving that the man who'd learned the lesson was worth more than the legend who'd never had to. And somewhere in those 30 days, without either of them quite marking the moment, Caldwell and Maya had stopped being adversaries and become something closer to colleagues, and then something closer to friends. He'd started calling her in to consult on decisions, not because Hayes required it, but because he'd learned that her eye caught things his didn't, and he'd finally reached the place where a leader wants that instead of fearing it. She'd started staying past her official mandate because Hayes had asked her to see the rebuild through, and because she admitted to herself she wanted to. On her last morning at Fort Liberty, Caldwell found her in the small office they'd given her 30 days before. I keep thinking about that first briefing, he said, sitting down across from her. You standing in front of my map, me laughing at you, and I keep asking myself, what did you see? In that moment, when I was calling you a brat in front of my whole command, what was going through your head? Maya thought about it. Honestly, sir, she said, I was thinking that you reminded me of my father. Caldwell blinked. That was the last answer he'd expected. My father was a fire chief, Maya said. 30 years, best in the county, everyone said. And he ran his station the way you ran this base, loud, certain, never wrong, or at least never willing to say he was wrong. And his men loved him and feared him in exactly the proportions your officers loved and feared you. She paused, and one day a young firefighter on his crew saw something wrong with a building they were about to enter, a structural thing, and he tried to tell my father, and my father waved him off the way you waved off Lieutenant Ross that morning. Because who was this kid to tell a 30-year chief about a building? Her voice was quiet. The building came down. My father lost 2 men that day. One of them was the young firefighter who tried to warn him. And my father spent the rest of his life knowing that if he just stopped for 10 seconds and listened to the youngest man on his crew, 2 people would have gone home. The room was very still. He told me that story exactly once, Maya said. When I was 17 and I just decided to enlist, and he was afraid I'd become the kind of officer he'd been. He said, Maya, the most dangerous words in any organization aren't spoken by the enemy. They're the words a good person doesn't say because they're afraid of the person in charge. And he made me promise, whatever I became, however high I rose, I'd build rooms where people weren't afraid to talk. She looked at Caldwell. That's what I do now, sir. That's my whole job. I go into commands that look perfect on paper, and I find the silence, and I find out whether the person in charge is my father before the building came down, or my father after. Whether they can still learn, or whether they've become a monument that's going to get people killed. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. And which one was I, he said, when you walked in? Before, Maya said honestly. You were my father before the building came down. Certain, loud, never wrong, sitting on top of a command full of people too scared to tell you the relay was running hot. She held his eyes. That's why I let the exercise fail, sir. I couldn't let your building come down with real people in it. So I let it come down with a simulation so you could learn the lesson without the funerals. It was the only mercy I had to offer. I let you fail small so you'd never fail big. And Admiral Thomas Caldwell, who had commanded soldiers for 40 years, who had called this woman a brat in front of 5,000 of them, sat across from her and understood fully for the first time exactly what she had done for him. She hadn't humiliated him. She'd saved him. She'd taken the worst version of himself out behind the building and shown it to him in a controlled burn so that the real fire would never come. Your father, Caldwell said, is he still alive? He passed 4 years ago. Did he know, Caldwell asked, what you'd become, what you do? Maya was quiet for a second. He knew I'd made colonel. He knew I did leadership evaluations. A small, sad smile. He didn't know the details. He didn't know I'd spent my whole career keeping his promise. I never told him because it felt like it would embarrass him, dragging up the worst day of his life every time I described my job. She looked down. I wish I'd told him. I think it would have helped him at the end to know that the 2 men he lost turned into something. That every command I fixed, every warning I made sure got heard was partly for them. Caldwell stood up, and he did something Maya didn't expect. He came around the desk and he offered her his hand, and when she stood and took it, he held it a moment longer than a handshake. Then let me tell you what he couldn't, Caldwell said. As a man who was exactly the officer your father was afraid you'd stop. You kept your promise, Colonel. You walked into a command that was one bad day away from a real disaster, and you took the disaster onto yourself instead, and you handed me back my soul in the bargain. Those 2 firefighters didn't die for nothing. They turned into you, and you turned into the reason a whole lot of soldiers who'll never know your name are going to go home to their families. His grip tightened. Your father would be proud, I'm certain of it, in a way I'm certain of very few things anymore. Because I watched you do it, and there is nothing in this world prouder than watching someone become exactly the person the people who love them hoped they'd be. Maya Anderson, who had stood unflinching in front of a furious admiral, who had bluffed a criminal off a keyboard, who had let 5,000 soldiers watch an operation collapse without so much as a change in her expression, found that her eyes were wet. Thank you, sir, she said quietly. There was a ceremony on her last afternoon. It hadn't been her idea. She tried to leave quietly the way she always left, filing her report and slipping out before anyone made a fuss. But Caldwell had insisted, and Hayes had flown back in for it, and when Maya walked out onto the training field, expecting a small formality, she found 5,000 soldiers assembled in formation. The same 5,000, the same field, the same soldiers who 31 days earlier had watched their admiral laugh in this woman's face and call her a brat. Caldwell stood at the front, and when Maya took her place beside him, he stepped forward to the microphone, and his voice carried across the field the way it had carried across the command center a month before, except that everything underneath it was different now. 31 days ago, Caldwell said, a colonel I'd never met walked into my command center and told me my plan was going to fail. And I laughed at her. I called her a name I'm not proud of in front of every one of you. I did it because I thought leadership meant being the smartest person in the room and having all the answers and never letting anyone see me doubt. He paused. I was wrong about all of it. The field was silent. She let me fail, Caldwell went on purpose, She stood in my command center and watched my operation collapse, and she didn't stop it because she understood something I was 40 years too proud to understand, that I would never learn from a warning. I would only learn from a wound. So she gave me a wound I could survive so that I'd never give you a wound you couldn't. His voice thickened. There are soldiers standing on this field right now who are alive in a hypothetical future they'll never know about because of what this woman did in a simulation a month ago. There are backups that exist again because she found the man who stole them. There's a reporting system that will catch the next disaster before it happens because she made me sit down and listen to the lowest ranking soldier on this base, and that soldier turned out to be one of the smartest people I've ever commanded. Somewhere in the formation, Staff Sergeant Emily Parker stood at attention with tears running down her face. "I told you a month ago that I failed you," Caldwell said. "That was true, but this woman made sure my failure cost us nothing but my pride when it could have cost us everything. She didn't defeat me. Everyone who watched that first briefing thought this was a story about a young colonel beating an old admiral." He shook his head. "It was never that. She didn't beat me. She saved me, and she saved this base. And she did it without ever once raising her voice or pulling her rank or taking the easy victory she had in her pocket the entire time." Caldwell turned to face her. "The greatest threat to any command," he said, "is not the enemy outside the wall. It's a leader who believes he already knows everything standing on top of people, too afraid to tell him he doesn't. Colonel Anderson spent 31 days teaching me that lesson. I'm going to spend the rest of my career living it. And I wanted every one of you to watch me say in front of the same field where I called her a brat that she was right and I was wrong, and I am a better man and a better commander because she had the courage to walk into my house and tell me the truth when no one else would." He stepped back, and he began alone to applaud. And then Hayes joined him, and then the officers in the front row. And then row by row, rank by rank, 5,000 soldiers came to attention and began to applaud, and the sound rolled across the training field like weather, and it did not stop. They weren't applauding because a colonel had beaten an admiral. Maya understood that standing there, letting the sound wash over her. They were applauding because they'd watched something rarer than a victory. They'd watched a powerful man admit he was wrong, and they had watched a talented woman refuse the cheap win in favor of the hard one, and they'd watched a base full of frightened people learn that the truth was safe again. Every soldier on that field had at some point in their career seen something wrong and been afraid to say it, and every one of them was applauding the woman who'd made it safe to speak. Maya didn't give a speech. When they finally quieted and Caldwell gestured her toward the microphone, she stepped up and she looked out at the 5,000 faces and she said only one thing. "Somewhere in this formation," she said, "there's a soldier who sees something wrong right now. Something small, something everybody else has walked past. And you've been afraid to say it." She let that sit. Say it, that's the whole thing. That's the entire lesson. The person closest to the problem usually sees it first, and the only thing standing between that person and a disaster prevented is whether they feel safe enough to open their mouth. Be the one who opens their mouth. Every catastrophe I've ever investigated could have been stopped by one person who wasn't afraid to speak one day earlier than they did. Don't be the silence. Be the voice, that's all. That's everything. And she stepped back. She left Fort Liberty that evening the same way she'd arrived, carrying nothing but a small tablet in a folder, except that the folder was thicker now, and the report inside it would change how 3 bases operated and would put 4 corrupt officers where they belonged and would stand as a model that Hayes would use for the rest of his career. But the report wasn't what she carried away that mattered most to her. What mattered was a memory. Emily Parker, on that first morning, hands shaking so badly she couldn't type her password, too frightened to say the true things she knew. And Emily Parker, 30 days later, Staff Sergeant now standing at attention with steady hands, having designed the system that would make sure no soldier on that base ever had to be as afraid as she had been. That was the thing Maya Anderson collected base after base, command after command. Not victories, not thanks. Just the faces of the people who'd been taught they didn't matter, learning that they did. She thought about her father on the drive out. She thought about the young firefighter who tried to warn him and hadn't been heard. And she thought the way she always thought when she finished a job, "I kept the promise, Dad. One more time, I kept it." The admiral who laughed at her had learned the hardest lesson of his life. The specialist everyone ignored had risen. The base built on silence had found its voice. And the young colonel that 5,000 soldiers had watched get humiliated on a command floor had walked out 31 days later, having proven the one truth she'd carried her whole life, the truth her father bought with the worst day of his. Talent does not ask permission before it appears a person's worth is never measured by their age, or their rank, or the medals on their chest. And the voice everyone in the room is too afraid to hear is almost always the one telling the truth that could save them all.